Hi, my name's Nick Barker. I am a game designer at Delphinium Games, and we have just put out a new game called Matcha. So, Matcha is a puzzle game, but beyond that, it's also an intuitive education game. And that means that the player is supposed to learn some real world skill or knowledge as a side effect of having fun playing the game. And in this case, Matcha actually teaches you to read the Korean written language Hangul. So by the time you finished solving all the puzzles in the game and gotten to the end, you should be able to read Hangul and pronounce it reasonably well, which I think is pretty cool. So this video is just going to be a bit of a reflection on the development process, how it went, how I came up with the ideas in the first place, some things that I tried that didn't work, some things that I tried that did work, and then at the end I'll just talk about what I think went well in the process and what I like about the game and the things that I feel didn't go so well that I'm going to try and improve on in my next game. So the entire development process of the game took about 9 months, and I was working on it part-time, so, an hour after work most days, and sometimes, like a 3-hour block on the weekend. And I think 9 months of part-time development for a game like this is pretty good. I'm actually really proud of being able to finish it in that amount of time. I was kind of thinking about it quite a lot for 3 months before I started working on it. It's built in Unity and C#, and there are some kind of drawings on the right-hand side of when I was planning out some initial ideas for the game just for fun. And I also just want to mention that I'm not sure whether working on it full-time would have made the process go any faster. So it's quite interesting. I think it actually I needed some time to reflect to really come up with the interesting ideas and concepts around the puzzles, and I'm not sure whether that process would have happened any quicker had I been working on it full time. I might have been able to make the graphics a bit more shiny or something like that, but I actually think this was the perfect way to develop a game like this. So it's late 2020, and I've been really interested in this concept of intuitive education games. As I mentioned before, games where the player learns some real skills as a side effect of playing the game. And, for a year I've been thinking about this and, reading about education theory and stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, I really want to do my first game finally, seriously approach a project. And I'm thinking about the kind of games that I want to make, and I'm personally very, very passionate about the educational process around music theory as one thing and mathematics as another thing, right? And I'm really interested in targeting them with an intuitive education game. And, there are a lot of reasons for this. Like, I really enjoy both of them despite really hating them when I was first introduced to them. And I find that, like, a lot of people who you talk to who have learnt music theory or mathematics, they will have similar kinds of feelings. They'll say, "Oh, I just don't get it. It's just too hard for me. My brain doesn't work with maths, or my brain doesn't work with music theory." And I think it's more of a failure of the way that we do education in those two subjects particularly. So I think it would be really interesting target for an intuitive education game. But I've never made a serious game before and released it. I've only made like little prototypes and stuff. And I really need something to cut my teeth first, because both of those areas are like big, right? They're significant and complex when you go deep into them. So I wanted to start and target something like really simple. So I started looking around for things that I could try with an intuitive education game, right? And at the time, I happened to be watching this Korean drama to wind down in my time off called Reply 1988. And I wanted to learn to read Korean for fun because I'd heard people say, oh, it's really easy, it's phonetic, the system's really well designed, you can learn it easily, and then you can read anything. It's not like Chinese where you have to learn, Mandarin where you have to learn 100,000 characters or whatever. And so I was like, oh, cool, I want to try learning to read some Hangul. So I went online and I looked at some tutorials, and some of them have different types of approaches, but the majority of the time, the way that what it all boils down to is like, oh, just memorize it. Like, there are 40 something characters, just memorize all of them and then you'll be able to read it, right? And I'm not the kind of person who can just memorize stuff like that easily. So I looked at some apps for it, and they're all just variations on like flashcards or intermittent reinforcement kind of things. So I decided, this could be a really cool opportunity for me to target as my first intuitive education game. So I decided to have something, to target something very simple, just reading Hangul, that's all. No vocabulary, you don't need to understand what you're reading, just being able to read the characters and pronounce them, right? And I thought that this was a very simple target. I'd be able to finish it easily. It's famous last words, because it's actually much more complicated than it seems on the surface. But it was a good choice, I think, to try and pick something very simple and small rather than bite off more than I could chew. So if you watch my video about intuitive education games, you'll know that kind of the first step to building an intuitive education game about a particular topic is you have to analyze the topic and figure out what systems are operating there, right? How do the systems in the Korean written language work? What are the rules? And the reason that we figure that out is so that we can align them to some system in a game that's fun to play with, right? It's actually quite a simple process. And so one of the systems that exists in Hangul is the concept of combining, right? So you can combine simple characters into syllables, you can combine syllables into words, you can combine words into sentences, that type of thing. So the idea of combining from simple concepts into more complicated ones is like a core idea in the way that it's designed. So I started thinking, okay, what fun game mechanics are there that involve combining simple things into more complex things? And I'd been playing, Factorio recently at the time, and I was thinking, in Factorio, you combine these simple materials together into more complicated things, and then you keep combining them into more and more complicated things, in factories. And I was thinking, maybe I could do like a factory automation game, but with Korean characters as the base materials, right? You can have conveyor belts that move your characters around, and then little machines that combine characters together into more complex sub-characters, combine syllables into words, that type of thing. And I was like, this seems like a really cool idea. So I started building a prototype for fun in Unity, and it kind of worked. I got it to the point where, you could put down your conveyor belts and you had things that produced sub-characters, and you had these bigger blocks that could combine them into more complex syllables. And it was kind of fun to play with, to set up your little automation and stuff. But I quite quickly realized that just combining characters together to form more complex things, or combining syllables to make words, doesn't actually teach you anything, because it's just visual, right? You can just see how the simple ones combine together. It doesn't teach you how they're pronounced, doesn't teach you to actually recognize them and think of the sound in your head, that type of thing. And not only that, it takes such a long time to set up these automation pipelines that you're mostly focused on that and not focused on discriminating between one character and another, and so you don't get enough repeat exposure to really solidify your memory of the characters. So it was an interesting idea, but I'd classify it as like a failure from an educational standpoint. But this experiment taught me a number of really interesting and useful things, right? The first one was that I discovered that if I made the grid small, there was some degree of like puzzle to the automation, because you had to think like, how can I efficiently use the space to actually create the characters that I need in only, like 5x5 grid squares or something. And that starts to lead you down this thought process of, if I combine these two characters together, then they only take up one space on a belt, right? Because it's a syllable with two characters instead of two separate characters, right? And then you start to think, maybe I could even combine characters together to save space on a belt, and then split them apart again later and use them separately, right? And then that leads you to this idea of like, if we're doing something like inputs and outputs, like you get certain inputs and then you need to create certain outputs, maybe you could have complex inputs and then you need to split those characters apart so that then you can use the components to recombine them into other complex outputs, right? And if you've played Matcha, you'll understand that that's kind of like the fundamental idea behind the way that the puzzles work, combining things together, splitting them apart, and using the rules of how characters can be combined and split to move things around the board in a clever way. So it was actually an incredibly valuable process, right? So the second prototype that I built was the game that ended up being released. I only built 2 prototypes, and the second one was the one that really worked, and I could tell early that it was working. So I persisted with it. I'll mention that the library for Unity Shapes by Freya Holmer, which is this 2D vector graphics library, was really, really useful. It allows you to produce just these beautiful anti-aliased 2D geometry that looks amazing on Retina devices. On the iPhone, it looks so good on those screens. And another thing that was really useful was Text Mesh Pro, which is this library kind of built into Unity. It's part of Unity, but is a separate package. But that allowed me to render the Korean language in the same way. Beautiful kerning and anti-aliasing. It just looks so good on the high-resolution screens. And as I built this prototype, I slowly kind of unearthed new ideas about mechanics that I could use, and the game just organically grew as I was building out the puzzles. So in terms of like the graphics, the visual theme of the game, I originally, as you saw from kind of like the automation prototype, I wanted to have something with like a forest theme and with like a stone board in the middle, like a game board for something like Go, like a stone kind of grid board, and you'd move like physical tiles around like game pieces. But when I switched to using the really simple just drag the tiles around on the board kind of game, and I ditched the automation idea, I had started to feel like what I actually needed was something incredibly basic and minimal, so that I could really let the beauty of the Korean language itself shine, because the written language is so gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful, and especially like with the various fonts that you can use for it, I just wanted it. I wanted to let the language sing on its own and not have my own kind of theme clobbered over the top of it. You know what I mean? I just wanted you to be able to see the characters for what they really were. And the color coding, I think, really helps with that. Some nice little trivia. I had 2 attempts at making the logo. I decided that I wanted to go with the name Matcha pretty early. For some bizarre reason, I almost always decide like what I want the name of a project to be before I even start the project. It's just a weird quirk of my design process. But I decided on Matcha as the name because I wanted to play on words. I like green tea, and I wanted to play on the words of like match, because the way that the game works is that you match the tiles to the outputs, to the answers. And so after I decided to go with Matcha, I wanted like a green tea latte thing as the logo. And the first one I did, I was looking at some inspiration, and I wanted to explore this idea of like this kind of perspective, flat 3D look. And I think the first attempt turned out pretty cool. And the really cool thing that I like about it is that it's actually kind of shaped like the Korean character for ma. You can see down the bottom there's this square with the a next to it, the m and a, and so the glass is kind of shaped like that. It's like a jar with a handle. But unfortunately, it was just a bit too detailed. And so when you shrink it down to like an app icon, you can't really see what's going on. It just looks messy. So my second attempt, I wanted something really reductive where you could squish it down to really tiny and still see exactly what it was. So the second attempt worked out well. And these were also both an opportunity for me to learn to use this app on the iPad called Vectornator, which is pretty good. It's not as good as Procreate, but I was able to produce some cool vector graphics with it, and this was just my learning experience for that. So the development process over the 9 months I built two or three levels maybe every day, and I was just making sure that I committed to spending that time to build two to three levels every day. It was extremely exhausting building the levels. After I did two or three, my brain was just fried, like having to think about the puzzles kind of backwards to create them and make sure that they were actually possible to do, and there weren't any like really obvious shortcuts that meant that you skipped the main bit of the puzzle. It's so exhausting. And so that took basically the entire development process. I was just slowly building the levels, two or three at a time. Originally, when you play the game, you'll realize that like every so often, on a regular cadence, it introduces new characters until it's eventually introduced all 40 something. And originally a new character came in every 4 levels, and non-native speakers, so people who'd never seen Korean before, gave me some feedback in my early play testing that it was too fast, and by the time that they got to level 40, they were forgetting which character was which. Their memory couldn't keep up. So I went back and increased it to 6 levels per character introduced. And the really interesting thing about this was, I actually recommend trying this if you're a game designer. I actually finished all the levels in groups of 4 before I went back and added 2 extra to each of the blocks, right? And so over the period of designing like 180 levels or whatever, I had really improved as a level designer in this type of game. I knew so many more tricks and mechanics and interesting ways to move the tiles around. And so this was actually really good because I went back and started adding 2 more levels very early on in the game, and it means that the early game experience got to benefit from my increased ability to make more interesting puzzles, my muscles that I developed in this. So I think if I hadn't done this process, if I'd done 6 in a row from the beginning, instead of going back and backfilling into the early levels, I think levels 1 to 100 would have been pretty boring. I don't think there would have been many clever or interesting mechanics in there at all. And that would have been a shame. So this was actually a really interesting way to do things. Instead of designing the levels in a linear way from beginning to end, you mix it up so that you don't have this obvious increase in your skill as a level designer towards the end of the game. I thought it would be fun to look at some features that I'd actually cut from the game because the game seems pretty simple, and the reason it's simple is because I cut some stuff. So even up until 2 weeks before I released the game, I had this feature called expert mode, right? And the way that it worked is that you can see on the right-hand side here, instead of the Romanized, the English versions that you of the outputs that you had to match to, you had these like sound buttons, and you could click it and it would pronounce the sound in your ear, and you had to match it to the sound instead of the English, right? And the reason I put this in is because, there's a lot of like purist thought about learning languages, especially like Korean or Japanese or Chinese, like, oh, don't learn the romanization. Just leave the English alone, learn the pronunciation, learn to hear it and associate the sound with the letter, and that's the correct way to learn it. But there were a couple of problems with this way of designing things. Like, firstly, the levels weren't any different. You could just play on expert mode where the English was hidden and there was a sound instead. So because the levels aren't really different, like, this feature does not add enough enjoyment or interest to justify playing the whole game twice, right? Solving all the same puzzles twice. Like, so there's just not enough interest there. And I did think about switching to audio only mode just for the last part of the game where you hear like whole words at a time or whole sentences at a time. But then I started to think like, a lot of people are going to be playing this on their phones, like on their commute on the train. They won't necessarily have sound, or maybe it'll be too loud for background noise for them to actually hear the sound properly. And of course, it would exclude people who are hearing impaired and that kind of thing. So yeah, I ended up deciding just to cut the feature completely. And I'm really glad that I did, because it was just a bit messy and hard to really understand the justification for. And I think cutting it made the game a much more clean and straightforward experience. Originally, the sticker book in the game had all 12,000 possible Hangul combinations. And it was a stupid idea. I don't know. I think I put it in just because I wanted, to prove that I could actually render a sticker book with 12,000 things in it or something. I don't know. But this is from the Wikipedia page on the right-hand side. And you can see that there are just so many and they're so complicated. And so I decided to limit the sticker book to just the answers that you could actually get in the game. And now it's kind of satisfying to watch it like fill out to 100% as you finish the last level in the game. So early on, before I decided that I didn't want to collect any data on any of my players at all. I built this little telemetry system so I could kind of figure out where people were getting stuck in the game. So because I had this original idea, maybe I'll send it out to beta testers and observe what they're doing. I decided not to do that. But the reason that I brought this up is these are some rows in a database. And so what I did was I actually serialized the board state and converted it into something that used all these emojis to demonstrate what the player was actually doing. So you can see these rows in a database. They're moving the n and to the right in that first row to the nyo, getting it correct, and then moving the n down to make the nu kind of, and then the ga across, and you can see them moving and submitting it. And I thought that was pretty cool that I was able to put this into into an Unicode text database. Some little tweaks that I made very late in the piece that I think really helped. The undo button used to restart the whole level. So if you made a mistake, you'd need to start the whole level from the beginning. And I originally, like a lot of game designers, I originally thought like, oh, this will incentivize the player to submit the correct answers and think carefully about what they're going to do. And that's just, it never works. It turns out it was just like pointlessly frustrating. So I changed it to just undo one move, and I think it works much better like that. Something that I think is actually really important and that will kind of slip under the radar if I don't mention it is that when I was developing the drag mechanics, it's one of the things that I spent the longest on. I wanted them to feel really good and look really good. When I first designed the drag mechanics, they looked like the one on the left here. And the way that it worked is that the tiles felt much more like they were kind of combining together, like these blobs that were pressing on each other and then snapping together. And I think it looked visually really good. But the way that it worked is that every combination you had to release your finger or the mouse button in order for it to apply, kind of thing. So you can see this requires actually 3 distinct moves here to combine things in the way that I want to combine them. And what I found was later on in the game, when you're combining and splitting stuff all over the place, it actually becomes super frustrating to have to like actually physically move your thumb 6 separate times to combine something that's complicated, right? So I changed the drag mechanics at the last minute so that you could just like chain drags and splits together. And you can see on the right hand side, it means that you can like wildly combine and split things. And it ended up just feeling so much better under your fingers as well. Which I'm so happy with. I was just very slightly unhappy with the drag mechanics for months, and then, right at the last minute, I changed them, and now I really like how they work. So just some advice, if you're an indie game developer, if you're a new developer, you're a new team, you're a new company, you're working on your first game. Some advice that really would have helped me is that you really want to incorporate as a company and get your company bank accounts set up as soon as you can, well before the release. And it's just because that process sometimes can take a long time with all the bureaucracy, and you'll need that stuff to sell your games on Steam and other stores. So Steam specifically, you need to be incorporated, and you need a bank account that exactly matches the name of your company. right? So just get that stuff set up early, get the admin out of the way, and then you'll be set by the time you want to release your game. So just some thoughts about what went well during the development process. I'll say that I'm very happy with the scope of the game, like the features and the completeness and the level of polish that I was able to get on that scope, right? I think it's a really good value game for $2 or $3, whatever it costs in your region. And I'm really happy that I was able to commit to a game of a decent size for my first attempt, but not bite off more that I can chew in terms of leaving edges unpolished. Like, I think I pretty much tied a bow around this game. It's pretty much how I want it to be, which I'm really happy with. The second thing is, I think the education concept in the game actually works, which is, I wouldn't say surprising, but I'm glad that it did work. And there are players out there who are learning to read Korean. You know, people send me these lovely messages being like, "Hey, I was struggling with my Korean before I played this game, and now it's going much better," which I'm so glad to have been able to help people, right? Another thing that went really well is it didn't take that long to build. 9 months part-time's really not bad, and I'm really happy that I was able to get like a lot done in a shorter amount of time. And Shapes and Unity really helped me with that. And the last thing is that I finished it to a level I was satisfied with at my own pace. I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel anxiety. I didn't feel like, I just need to release this game or anything like that. Which, judging from what I've read, is actually reasonably rare in the games industry. So I'm glad that I was able to have that. So just to talk about some things that I think didn't go so well, things that I'll try to improve on. I think that it's a cool idea, and when I explain it to people, they're like, "Oh, it's such a cool idea." But I think that the game just isn't objectively fun enough. And what I mean by that is, like, the biggest evidence is that when I explain this game to people, I don't think that it's strong enough to just stand on its own without leaning on the Korean learning aspect, right? And you're probably wondering, like, "Oh, well, why does that actually matter?" Like, it's an educational game. Isn't it supposed to be teaching what it's supposed to be teaching? And the thing is, intuitive education games, which I'm trying to build, if you watch my video about that, the main thing is that the game has to stand on its own, and it has to be fun enough that people can enjoy playing the game even if they don't even want to learn the skill that it's trying to teach you, right? It has to be strong enough as a game that you learn as a side effect of having fun, right? And I think I didn't quite nail it with this game. I found that the majority of the people who are playing it through to the end and who are motivated to play the game are people who are interested in learning Korean, which is great for them, but it's not what I was aiming to do. And I hope that for my next game, I'll be able to release it as a standalone game, and I won't have to lean on the educational aspect of it. That can just be a side effect, as I wanted. Something else that didn't go so well was that there were just a couple of minor bugs on release that I needed to push an update to fix. And, that might not sound like a big deal. They weren't game-breaking bugs in any way. You could still play the game, finish it. But the way that I look at it is, if you look at the values statement on our website, one of the biggest things that I want to aim for is just, I want to push out our games in a completed state. You buy them for a certain amount of money. That's all the money that you ever pay. You buy the whole game, and it never gets updated again after that. That's the kind of games that I want to make. And I am a bit frustrated that I didn't manage to hit it on with this one. And for next time, what I'm going to do is that my release process is going to be, I will build the final release of the game. And then before submitting it, I'm going to play the entire game from beginning to end to 100% completion. Like, I did it in pieces this time. So like, I played to like 40%, made a small change, and then played the rest of the game. And that small change caused a couple of errors in the first 40%, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to build out the game, play it completely to 100%, and if I find any bugs, I'm going to fix them, and then I'm going to build the whole game and play it again completely 100%. And I'm going to make sure that the next one really works to the best of my ability. You know, I'm not dogmatic about this kind of stuff, but I do want to try and get it right the first time. And the last thing is that the trailer that I made for the game is fun, and I'm really proud of it. I like the music. I like, you know, the way that it's designed, but I got some feedback that it doesn't really show you how the game actually works. And yeah, that's a bit of a problem. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll build and release a gameplay trailer for Matcha, and for my next game, I'm going to build I'm going to make both a cinematic trailer, so to speak, like, you know, a release trailer, a launch trailer, and a gameplay trailer, and I'll put them out at the same time. So one will be kind of trying to cultivate some interest in the vibe, for lack of a better word, and the other is going to be specifically about, okay, well, if you want to know exactly how this game works before you buy it, here's actual gameplay footage of someone playing the game, you know. But overall, I'm so happy with how this went. I'm really, really proud of it. I'm proud to put it on my resume, in my portfolio. I think it's one of the best things that I've ever done. And as a result, I'm very motivated to work on my next thing. So just some little information about that, like Delphinium's next game is going to be, of course, it's going to be an intuitive education game, but this one's going to teach you about music theory and specifically about improvisation. So, you know, jazz improvisation or modern music improvisation, making up music as you go along that fits well with a set of chords. So I think it's going to be a rhythm game, so to speak. The best way I can describe it is that it's going to be a rhythmic and kind of very musical oriented version of Overcooked. If you've ever played Overcooked, it's going to be a similar type of vibe to that. And the working title for the game at the moment is Consonance, which I think is going to be the name of one of the main characters, and it's a word that means the opposite of dissonance. So the idea is that you're learning to play in consonance with the music. So I'll be documenting that process as I develop the game, probably on my personal channel, or actually maybe I'll put out videos on the Delphinium channel as well. But yeah, if you're interested, come follow along. I would love to hear your feedback and show you how things are going. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy playing Matcha, and until next time,